So good afternoon, everyone. So Saheli, welcome you in the League Career Researchers webinar series of IMI India. So Saheli is an assistant professor of economics at the Center for Quantitative Economics and Data Sciences at BITS. Previously, she holds a postdoctoral fellow position at Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. She did her PhD from Jadavpur University in Economics, and her research interests include development economics, and she is currently working on washes and the household behaviors. Today, she will talk about peer effects in household waste disposal, which is a very important topic. And you know, RISE is the emerging area of development research to study the social networks, peerhood, and the neighborhood effects. So, Sahili, you have 35 to 40 minutes for the presentation and the remaining 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. So, if anybody has any clarificatory questions, so can you please put in the chat box? So, Sahili will take on those questions between the presentations. Otherwise, we will take questions in the end of the talk. So thanks. So Saheli, now floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation and for this opportunity to present my paper. So this is a paper that I'm working on. This is a work in progress, and all comments are actually welcome. So this paper looks into peer effects in household waste disposal, and I look into the waste disposal behavior of households in rural India. Now, uh, yeah, sorry. Yeah. So what motivated me to look into this problem is what I found on field in the rural areas, particularly in West Bengal. And in developing country context, management of household waste, particularly plastic waste, is turning out to be a challenge. And when we talk about waste management, it includes a host of different activities, starting from, waste segregation from within the households to waste collection, recycling, whatever can't be recycled, disposing them in a scientific manner. And this chain of activities is lacking in many developing countries, particularly in India and especially in rural Indias. So as a result, often households dispose their waste in open areas like streets or near water bodies. And this kind of behavior has consequences. It creates environmental pollution. There's a possibility of contamination and degradation of nearby water bodies because the liquid from the uh, disposed waste leaches into the soil and can contaminate water bodies. Due to plastic waste, it can lead to choking of drains or water streams. So this creates a problem, and I look into this problem in the Indian context, particularly in rural India. So I use data from the NS. So there's this data set which I talk about later in the presentation. So in most rural areas, in most villages, households report that they don't have a formal waste collection system. And this number is, so it has increased the number of households who have reported that there's no agency made arrangement for garbage collection in the rural areas. It has increased from 68% in 2012 to 80% in 2018. Even though, and we are talking about the post Swachh Bharat mission situation where there has been a mass campaign on reducing open defecation, environmental cleanliness, etc. And so in some villages, the panchayats collect waste. The proportion is very small. Only 11.4% households in 2018 has reported that panchayats collect waste from their locality. And Majority of the households in 2018 reported that they dispose waste in open areas and not in community dumping spots or vats, as we commonly call, or in individual dumping grounds, individual dumping spots. So most households in rural areas dispose waste in open areas. So in terms of public health, it has consequences for the environment, for how our water bodies, particularly in the rural areas, are managed, and things like that. So, which is why I thought that it's an important problem to take up. And now, from the economics point of view, waste collection or waste management, it reflects a kind of market failure associated with common property resources. So in rural areas, because local government, the system is not in place, uh, the system of waste collection is not in place by the local government. There's absence of regulation. There's negative externalities from pollution from waste disposal activities in unregulated spaces. So if there's negative externality, then there's a tendency to overproduce those goods. So there's a tendency of households to dispose waste in a polluting manner, uh, particularly when there's no regulator or no social sanction is involved. But waste disposal from the household's perspective presents a case of strategic complementarities. So initially, it might be costly for an individual household to dispose waste safely, but as more and more households adopt safer ways of disposing waste, the benefits from the cleaner environment becomes more, and then the more households will adapt to that kind of waste disposal strategies. So households have an incentive to take actions, which is increasing in the number of peers who take the same action. So the more households adapt to safe waste disposal strategies, a household will be more likely to adapt to that kind of strategy. But if a majority of the households dispose waste here and there, then that will be the best response for an individual household as well. So there's waste disposal shows this kind of complementarity, and so an individual household has incentives to align its behavior households. Now this can work in both ways. It can induce someone to dispose waste in a polluting manner, or it can induce a household to dispose waste in a clean manner. So what drives this is the peer effects, or what the social norm in that particular context is. Now, there have been other studies which have shown that informal institutions that involve local communities may work to, protect common property resources. So here the communities are involved. There are some kind of social sanctions involved, and which may actually protect common property resource. So this is the motivation for me to look into the problem of look into this aspect, that whether individual households waste disposal practices is associated with the average behavior of households, peers, or reference groups. So this is the research question that I actually address in this question, and I look into the waste disposal. So by saying that waste disposal practice, the dependent variable in this paper is whether the household is disposing waste in open areas or open streets and drains. And by peers, I mean that what other households in its neighborhood and within the neighborhood. So we don't always have homogeneous neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are quite heterogeneous even in the rural context. So I look into what the behavior. So when I talk about peer effects, I also look into the behavior of peers within the own caste members of a household, and also across caste groups within the neighborhood. So I'll discuss this when I talk about the methodology. So before proceeding further, I just discuss the literature very briefly. So there are many papers which look into the waste disposal activities and waste management in developing countries, but the focus is more on urban areas. So there are papers which are looking at municipal solid waste management and how that affects or how that contributes to clean environment. You know, uh, waste is transported and how what the end use of the waste generated is. There are certain papers which have identified information gaps or market asymmetries, and which look into the knowledge, the role of knowledge, practices, and attitudes, like whether the households are aware of waste disposal or making them aware. So there are some RCTs which are focused on the awareness of households, making them aware and providing them waste bins for segregation of waste, etc., and look into the aspect of waste management. But there's also uh, this paper by Bharadwaj et al. 2020, which has found in some context there has to be monitoring, enforcement, and fines. Uh, Anyone who violates the norm of, violates the norm of not disposing waste, and these fines are monitoring or enforced.
Hello, hi, Saheli.
Hello.
Saheli, you are not audible.
Maybe she's rejoining.
Sorry, I just lost the connection.
And now you are audible and visible. Okay, go ahead.
Um, so, yeah, so till where was I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Uh, okay. So there's this literature which looks into waste disposal management and waste disposal management in urban areas, particularly in the developing countries. So my paper contributes to that, but I focus on the rural areas. But at the same time, I also look into the peer effects. So there's another strand of literature on peer effects and different technology adoption. And particularly this paper relates to the role of peer effects in sanitation practices actually. So this is a new literature that is emerging that, in developing countries uh, and also in India, we have, there's literature which shows that households adopt to sanitation, like the use of toilets. So there's peer effects associated with the use of toilets in India. So my paper contributes to this literature, and it, it analyzes whether there is, so first it analyzes waste disposal practices prevailing in rural India, and whether peer effects is at all important or not, as it has been found in to be important for adoption of pro-environmental and sustainable actions. What I find is, the results show that there is association between group behavior and individual behavior as far as waste disposal practices are concerned. And the social structure is important, particularly if we are to bring about a behavior change in the households, whether to induce them to dispose waste in a more sustainable manner. And the results also highlight, how different group formations or network formations can be used, for targeting different groups, and how the within group and across groups spillovers in waste disposal activities can be leveraged by the policymakers or the local governments. So social networks influence our behavior. So this is the formal model. So I don't have all the maths here. I just describe what is happening. So social networks, so we all get influenced by what our peers are doing. And the waste disposal behavior is actually, it's similar to the threshold gains of complements. So households can choose whether to dispose waste in open areas, or alternatively, they can choose to dispose waste in a cleaner way. But if they want to dispose waste safely, there's a higher cost associated with it. One can think of it to be cost, the time cost or the effort, or the distance that one has to travel to, put the waste in a manure, or segregate and dispose the waste in a proper manner. But when there's a pollution, or when someone is disposing waste in open areas, there's a negative externality of pollution. So there's a divergence of the private cost that the individual is incurring and the social cost. So because the social cost is higher than the private cost, individuals will have a tendency to dispose waste in a more polluting manner, absent any kind of social sanction or social regulation. But as more and more households dispose waste in a safe manner, then the social benefits tend to increase. So then individuals have an incentive to adopt the cleaner waste disposal practices if other households are, if other households beyond a threshold level adopts the same strategy. So if households beyond that threshold level adopts the cleaner ways of waste disposal, then an individual household will have more incentives to dispose waste safely in the environment. But if most households don't adopt that clean strategy, if they dispose waste in open areas, then individual households will also have incentive to align with this kind of action. So this is how peer effects come into play, that if households beyond a threshold, whatever actions they take, the other households will mimic that. Now, because we are talking about peer effects, it's important to talk about networks, particularly in the context that we are studying, which is rural areas. So we are talking about village networks. Now, normally in many peer effect papers, people have taken the entire villages as the reference group. So, but the criticism here is that I'll take the questions before I start the data analysis part. Okay. So, but when entire villages are taken together, the criticism is that villages are quite large, and so one household who is living away from another household may not influence each other's actions. So this is one criticism, which comes up when people use neighborhoods as a definition for defining the peers or the reference group. But I'll address this criticism in the empirical analysis. But the other aspect of networks in the Indian context is the caste network. So connections exist beyond villages through marriage and kinship. But I focus on caste networks only within villages, and the motivation for that is that the effect of pollution from waste disposal is local in nature. So it's unlikely that someone who's located in a different village but is related to me will get influenced by my actions. So I restrict the networks to the villages and also within the caste. And I use neighborhood and caste network to define peers. Now, to address, to answer the question, I use data from 2 rounds of national sample survey. I use the data set on drinking water, sanitation, hygiene, and housing condition. So the data sets are from the 69th round in 2012 and 76th round in 2018. So I have a repeated cross-section data of sample size of almost 1,12,000 households. Now, why I use this data? This is the only data set which gives a nationally representative sample with information on waste disposal methods adopted by households. But the data set also lacks many things which I'll also discuss towards the end of the presentation. So there's also information on different socioeconomic characteristics of the households, individual characteristics of household members, and some data on some neighborhood amenities like roads, streetlights, etc. The other reason why I use this data set is that I exploit the sampling design of NSS. So what NSS does is it divides larger villages into hamlet groups, and from those hamlet groups, so the hamlet groups forms the first stage sampling unit. So it divides the larger villages into smaller localities from which it picks up the households for sampling. So I exploit this kind of sampling design of the NSS to define neighborhoods, and from that neighborhood I get peer effects. So the sampling design of NSS allows me to overcome the criticism about having larger villages and defining neighborhood effects on the basis of larger villages. So that problem is addressed here. The outcome variable of the outcome variable that I'm interested in is whether the household disposes waste in open areas, that is in open streets, ponds, or open drains, or other places in the villages. Now, across the 2 periods of time, I find that 47% of households report that they dispose waste in open areas. Alternative to this disposing waste in the open areas is disposing waste to manure pits, biogas plants, individual dumping spots, community dumping spots, etc. And as I mentioned earlier that this outcome variable, so whether the household is disposing waste in open areas or not, so this has increased to 54% in 2018 from 39% in 2012. This despite the fact that there's so much awareness about Swachh Bharat mission, etc. The main explanatory variable that I'm interested in is waste disposal behavior of households, peer households. That is, its neighbors or its reference group. So the first reference group is, all other households within the villages. And the second reference group I use is that households belonging to the household IS community within the village. So if the IF household is a SC household, then the reference group would be SC households within the households uh, village hamlet. That would be my explanatory variable of interest. So to address the question now, so I don't evaluate social benefits here. So social benefits, so this is just the theoretical, conceptual framework that I use to motivate why there would be a peer effect or what could drive peer effect, and that is there. But I don't explicitly measure social benefits here because one important reason is that there's very limited data. So there's no data which matches the health benefits or health outcomes with the waste disposal activities of the household. So that's one of the
Saheli,
problems.
Saheli,
Yes,
Saheli, can I interrupt you for a second? Right,
yes,
so I just want to clarify this household disposal in open streets increased from 39% in 2012 to 54% in 2018. Is that statement correct?
yes,
Okay. So it increased over the period, right?
yes.
Okay.
So if you see, so here in this graph, I plot the proportion of neighbors disposing waste in open areas. Okay, and you see that there is a bulge at the two extreme ends of the distribution. So wherever, and this information is for, so the blue line is for 2012 and the dashed line is for 2018. So if you see that so in villages where households are disposing waste in the open areas, most households are doing that. And in villages where households are not disposing waste in the open areas, most other households are conforming to that. So there is, concentration in the two ends of the distribution. When so this is when I take the behavior of all neighbors in the village, but I get a similar graph when I take the proportion of own community members disposing waste in open spaces. So even here also I get the same thing, but I see that the proportion of individuals, households who are disposing waste in open areas is increasing in the 2 years, regardless of the definition that I take. Okay, so this graphs show that there could be some possibility in, I mean, there's some possibility that there's peer effects in waste disposal activities. So I look into that, but in there are some challenges associated with estimating peer effects. So here I'm using cross-sectional data. So in cross-sectional data, I cannot claim causality here because the reference group, I mean, it's not randomized group formation. So there's this possibility that the households have migrated and self-selected into different localities according to their preference of public goods or other amenities that are there in the localities. So that's one problem that we have. The other thing is that, this I talked about briefly about how we define the neighborhood. So I use the uh, location, the village hamlets as a neighborhood, and I also exploit the social group identity, caste identity. But there's also the problem of contextual effect in peer effects. So so households, the motivation is of peer effects is that a household will mimic the behavior of other households in the neighborhood, but they could behave similarly because their characteristics are similar. So that contextual effect. So I account for the contextual effects also. And the third problem is related to the correlated effects. Well, households could also behave similarly because they are exposed to the same external environment, or they are exposed to the same shocks. So I include the district fixed effects and the time fixed effects to account for this. So this is the estimated, the equation that I estimate, where I take the entire hamlet as peers. So yi is my dependent variable, which is equal to 1 if household disposes waste in open spaces and it takes 0 otherwise. The main coefficient of my interest is this rho, and this WIVT bar, this gives the proportion of household ice neighbors in the hamlet who disposes household waste in open spaces within the village. Then I control for different household characteristics. So I include households, the highest education of males, highest education of females, household land holdings, and other characteristics. Now X bar IVT, this accounts for the contextual effect. So it gives the average characteristics of how the peers of household I, and this then I also have the district fixed effects and the year fixed effects. This is when I have the entire hamlet as peers, and then I also have the caste network in the hamlet as peers. So here I have the main explanatory variable here is the waste disposal activity of own caste group members of household I's caste in the village, and that takes into account the in-group peer effect. But I also look into the out-group peer effect, which is given by row 2. The other variables are defined as are the same as I defined earlier. So now I come to the results. What I find is that there is evidence of peer effects in waste disposal activities. So the column 5 here, it gives the results after controlling for all the household contextual effects, household characteristics, district fixed effects, and year fixed effects, and I find that I get so the result is this, that if the extent of waste disposal, the average extent of waste disposal increases by 1 unit, then a household is more likely to dispose waste in the open areas by 0.53. Now I come to this results of what happens within group and out across groups. So what I find is that within group peer effect is greater than across community. So, and which is quite obvious because caste network within villages, I mean, like there's more affinity within your own community members than across community members. So what your own community members do is more likely to influence your activity compared to what others do across communities. And another reason for this is that in many villages there's a spatial segregation on caste lines. So different caste groups are located in different hamlets. So what is happening within your hamlets is more likely to influence your own actions than what is happening across different hamlets. So this is there, but what I also find is that there's heterogeneity across different caste groups. So the own community peer effect is highest among the OBCs, while other community peer effect is higher among the general castes and the SC/STs. So this result is also important because suppose there is a policy which targets the SC/STs in terms of how to dispose waste, or ways to dispose waste properly. So the general caste and the SC/STs are more likely to benefit from each other because of their across community spillovers are more, compared to the OBCs whose cross-community spillover is low and their own community spillover is greater. So if the OBCs have to be targeted, the results show that it's best that they be targeted, and because there's less spillover across communities for the OBCs. Now, the other challenge that I have faced in establishing, causality in peer effects is migration of households. Even though migration is low in rural areas, I mean, households do not migrate entirely, or it's less in proportion compared to the proportion of households who decide to stay at their natal place. But still, I mean, why people settle in communities, or someone belonging to one community will go and settle in the place where people from his or community lives, that kind of thing can't be ruled out. So what I do here is so NSS gives information on how long a household has been staying at the current place of residence. So I divide the sample into three categories. So households who have lived in one place for less than 5 years, for between 5 to 20 years, and for more than 20 years. Now I find that across all these three different groups, there's peer effects. But own community peer effect increases with the duration of stay in the current locality. So the longer a household has stayed in the current locality, it shows more peer effects in waste disposal activity. And sorry, the peer effect across communities is highest for households who have lived in a particular locality for less than 5 years. So these are what the results I have got. So I have summarized. So this is just the summary of the results. So just to repeat that there's peer effects, and own community peer effects is stronger than cross community peer effects. And this holds despite controlling for a host of variables. And but the analysis has some limitations. So first limitation is that there's limited data on waste disposal activities. Households generate waste on different types of waste: plastic waste, electronic waste, kitchen waste, etc. But NSS clubs all the information on waste disposal for all these different kinds of waste together. There is also lack of data on segregation of waste, recycling methods that are adopted by households. In fact, it would be more interesting to see whether there's peer effects in segregation of waste or not, because that's the next level of challenge that we are facing in waste management issues right now. Even in urban areas, we have different baskets for collecting waste, but households are reluctant to segregate waste. Either because others are not doing it, and the municipalities who are collecting the waste also, they tend to mix the waste which are segregated at source. So the segregation of peer effects in segregation of waste would have been a more interesting thing to look at, but there's no national data on this. And also there's very little information on what the information gaps are, or what the source of information gaps are for the households, whether they lack knowledge on different waste disposal methods, or the consequences of disposing waste in an unsafe manner, or whether it is the case that no one, the panchayat or the local leaders are not taking the initiative to solve the waste disposal problem at the local level. Also, there's this problem of our attitude with waste. So how we deal with our waste. So often it is the case that, if the waste is out of sight, then it's not my problem anymore. But the question is whether it matters to the households if they dispose waste in a manner such that their water source is getting contaminated, or in the long run it is choking the streams and causing floods, whether it matters to the households or not. So these are also issues that we need to look into when we are concerned about the behavioral aspects of waste disposal of households. So this is what I have to present. Questions and comments, I see some.
So thank you, Saheli, for a very nice presentation. So now, so let's go for question and answers. So Shreya, so I saw you have a question written
I
in the chat
yeah,
box. Yeah,
I
please
think
go
it
on.
was a little early on in the presentation, but it would still help to clarify a little bit because I don't necessarily uh, understand the entire math of it. But if you could just explain that one question which I had was how exactly do you evaluate? Because the thresholds seem to be decided quite a bit by how these social benefits at what level do they exceed costs, right? And how are these perceived? So I just wanted to know how do you evaluate them for you to be able to compare these?
Uh, so it's a very important question, but unfortunately, there's no data on this at the national level. I mean, like, I don't account into the cost or the benefits in this particular analysis. It's just a theoretical explanation. So if because the motivation for using this or how the reason why I talk about this is what motivates peer effects or when do peer effects come into play. Peer effects can work either ways, right? It can influence a household to not dispose waste in a polluting manner, or it can also induce a household to dispose waste in a polluting manner. What matters is what the others are doing in the neighborhood. Now, if the benefits of disposing waste safely is exceeds the cost, then more households are likely to adopt it. But that here I don't use this information explicitly because there's no
Contribution,
data
yeah.
on this. But I just use this expression to motivate the problem of peer effects or why peer effects should matter.
So the graph that you present here, which I thought was interesting because it has these two extremes, right?
Yes.
And also I think in 2018, it's not just about. I mean, first interesting thing is that they both have the same shape, which means that there's something about the behavior that is high on these two levels of extremes in terms of peer effects. But also interestingly, in 2018, it dips earlier and it
Yes.
goes up before, right? Earlier and
Yes.
higher up. Can you just help me to understand and interpret this graph vis-a-vis the kind of thresholds that we were discussing? Do you think that this graph could give us some indication towards where these thresholds are in terms of at what point do people start behaving differently about waste disposal?
Yeah, I think like so what we find here is that you know so if most people are disposing waste, I mean there's some coordination within the households that are happening here. So if someone is disposing waste in so when I look at the left of the graph, it means that fewer households are disposing waste in open spaces. Okay, and to the right, it's like more households are disposing waste to the in the open spaces. So, sorry. So what we find here is that it's concentrated on the two ends of the graph. So where households are disposing waste in open spaces, most households are disposing waste in open spaces. And where households are not disposing waste in open spaces, most households are conforming to that. So, but here again, we don't have, so this, we don't have information on costs and benefits or what exactly the threshold is. So this is just this is a work in progress. So I also want to look into the regional aspects of it because I've taken all India data. So whether, there's heterogeneity across states or not, because different states have different norms about cleanliness or social norms about what is acceptable, where to dispose waste is acceptable or not. There are these different norms in it. So that's the next thing that I want to take up in this paper. But as I mentioned, there are many kinds of data challenges that I'm facing because, there's data limitation. So when I'm looking into this problem, so plastic waste is more of a problem compared to, say, kitchen waste. And when we talk about littering, I mean, the pollution comes more from plastic waste actually. People are putting all kinds of things in plastics and they're disposing it here and there. So, but, like I haven't come across any national data set which gives me this kind of information or on segregation and things like that. Or what cost, I mean, like what how problems the households are facing due to pollution. Uh, that kind of information at the disaggregated level is not there right now.
Right.
So,
Yeah, Shreya, please go on.
No, Deepak, please go ahead. I have a ton of questions, but I think that's more for the method clarification than anything else. Thanks.
No, Saheli, right? So have you checked this National Annual Rural Sanitation Survey? So the government of India conducted 3 rounds of survey. The first one in 17, 18, 18, 19, 19, 20, right? So it's a nationally representative data set and it's publicly available. So they have a lot more detailed questions on this sanitation aspects. So I'm not sure whether, right?
sir,
So
could
you
you
have
just uh, repeat what the data set is?
NARS, NARSS, National Annual Rural Sanitation Survey.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
the
it
government,
has some, I checked this, I think the latest round. It has some information, but not all actually.
yeah, right. So one suggestion is to check this data set, and the second, right. So I have this comment on the method, right. So right. So I know you have done all standard things to the extent, right. So to account for the whole endogeneity, and confounder issues, but right. So right. So we can say, right, so this could be association, but if you just take the village averages, just think of a scenario where in a village where there is no community based infrastructure for dumping these wastes, right? So that may be correlated with the proportion of households who are dumping into open areas, right? So those kind of concerns are still there in your empirical framework. So just think of that and just try to bring those community kind of infrastructure related variables on the right hand side to account for that. So that would be something you need to think and how to best address those issues, because anyone can argue that if you're just attributing this as a neighborhood or peer effects, that could be because there is no public infrastructure available for dumping for everyone. So right, so that's why
Yes.
they all are dumping those things into the open areas. So those kind of things you need to address.
Yes. Sorry. So I take those variables also, whatever is available in the NSS data set. So despite, I mean, even for controlling, after controlling for those variables, I get the peer effects to be positive.
Right, so those are the individual or household level variables, right? So you have picked up just community level
Acha.
infrastructure, right? So that drives your behavior to dump in into the open, or whether you would like to dump in into the dustbin or some community based
Okay.
dustbin kind of thing. And so for that you need those community level variables, village or district level variables, not the district but at the village, so to account for that, right?
Okay.
So any other question from anyone? Shreya, if you would like to come in for any.
No, I mean, honestly, I think I got stuck on the graph because I thought it was really interesting. I think that graph that's something that can be compared across different kinds of communities, states, cultural parameters. I think that, I mean, I think just as a listener for this paper, that graph would be a very interesting tool to compare across different contexts to see if waste disposal, and because waste has, like you said, a lot of say caste perceptions as well in terms of geographies, etc. So yeah, I'm sorry, just an observation. I think if you this is a national level work, if you do it at the state level for different regions and different communities, I think comparing that graph and how it dips or rises differently for different communities would be an interesting comparison.
Thank you. I would look into this graph more. I mean, in more details, actually. Thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you, Saheli and Rais. So we are happy to, with your presentation, we are happy to conclude this hour. And in fact, this is the last edition of the IWMI India ECR series. So thanks a lot. Right. So
Thank you for having me, and thank you
good
for the
you are here.
comments.
Yeah.
Saheli,
So
thank
thanks,
you.
and thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, bye.